Well, hi there. So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit about what is economic growth, how can we model it in the PPC and the ADAS, and then last, we'll finish with a discussion about what are the government policies that we could use to increase aggregate supply, which were sometimes called supply-side economics. Let's get started. Okay, so the first little part here just kind of summarizes what we already know about economic growth, that it's really determined by this thing called the production function, which we learned about way back in I even put that on here, micro 3.1. It's something about how basically inputs are turned into outputs. We made a paper chain with it in class and did some kind of simulations of it. Economic growth is really kind of determined by then how well do we do that, right? How well do we do this process of turning inputs into outputs? And the two basic determinants are productivity and resource availability. This would be saying how productive your inputs are, right? Can they produce more stuff? And so if your inputs become more productive, you get more outputs. So that would be something that you could affect by infrastructure. This is just what we call, it's a fancy name for the public capital goods, right? So public capital goods are things like highways and ports, right? That kind of thing, railroads. Capital equipment in general, this is like private capital equipment, so computers and cash registers and other machines that improve our productivity, and labor training, certainly how well our labor is trained to be able to work in a modern technological kind of economy. The other thing that's going to affect economic growth, or this kind of relationship of inputs and outputs, is how available are your inputs? Do you have inputs, right? And are they expensive? Are those inputs difficult to obtain? And so are there lots of resources, and how expensive are they? That can affect, well, how quickly and how easily you can turn inputs into outputs. So if you could increase both of these or one of these in some way, you could increase economic growth, right? So fundamentally, that's where economic growth is going to come from. Now, you will sometimes see questions that ask about what's economic growth look like in a PPC? Well, civilian goods and military goods, or good A and good B. Economic growth always is going to look like an outward shift, right? That's economic growth. So it would actually indicate an increased capacity to produce. In the ADAS model, we've actually got the LRAS function, and LRAS shifting to the right would actually show us the same concept, right? Our productive capacity was at YF, and now it's at YF1. So these would be economic growth. We're not typically going to be drawing, especially not typical to draw on AP FRQs. So this one is not typical to draw this one on AP FRQs. You will have to draw the ADAS model, but it's very unusual to actually show the LRAS shifting. Now, there are some things that we can do as an economy, as a government, right? Public policy, if you want to kind of think about how could we do these? How could we make our things more productive or get more resources? In general, we call these things supply side policies, right? Because these are aggregate supplies. That's where the name comes from. How could we push this aggregate supply curve with right? So supply side economics, I've had students tell me over the years that it's called trickle down economics in other contexts. Supply side economics is way bigger than just like tax cuts, right? So push that aside for a second and hear some clear information, right? There are a bunch of things that could cause aggregate supply to shift to the right. All of these would be supply side economics. More workforce training and education programs to increase productivity. So if you fund your education systems, your pre-K, that's going to be the biggest thing that's going to boost productivity in a lot of cases. Get those 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds to be able to read and write. That's a huge boost to them. My wife is an elementary school teacher, and sometimes she gets kindergartners who can come in and read and write, and they are off to the races, right? Those are the kind of kids that end up in AP Econ. Then she also gets kids who come in and don't know their numbers, they don't know their letters. In some cases, they've never been in any institutional setting. They literally, some of them they'll go to the garbage and eat food out of the garbage. How do you think that kid's going to grow and succeed in this country if we haven't invested in them, right? So a big piece of this is workforce training and education. We got to spend on infrastructure. That's the public capital goods, right? Faster transportation, it makes it cheaper to produce. So it's very simple. You build a highway, you build a railroad, you build a port, you build high-speed internet, and you make sure that you've got a clean electric grid that delivers enough electricity at cheap costs. All of that stuff is infrastructure, right? So that is how you actually can lower costs of production. That's supply side economics. Deregulating businesses to lower their cost of production, allow them to dispose of waste in cheaper ways, or maybe emit more pollutants, right? Some of those things are trade-offs, right? You've got to kind of think about, is the lemon worth the squeeze? But deregulation absolutely can speed up production, and it can allow us to turn inputs into outputs more effectively. A fourth one is promoting immigration. If we have more immigrants, or in particular skilled immigrants, or we weaken union bargaining power. This is sometimes called labor flexibility. I know that it sounds like it's a euphemism here, but it's really saying, how can we allow our labor, immigrants and people who are in labor unions, how can we allow them to be turned into output more efficiently? Maybe a labor union contract has locked a business into a particular way of doing things that's not very efficient. And so if you can weaken those kind of contracts, that sometimes can unleash a lot more productivity. It can unleash a lot more lower costs. Immigration is a direct kind of relationship. You bring in more skilled immigrants, that's literally more inputs that can be turned into outputs. Tax cuts. Now, tax cuts are obviously a big part of supply side economics if you know anything about it, but it's really tax cuts that promote investment spending. And so there's a lot of different ways that you could get that, right? You could get a tax cut directly on investment spending. You could say to a business, we're going to cut your taxes when you buy new machines. You could say, well, let's go back up a few steps. Let's do tax cuts on high income households. Those households are going to flow that savings into the loanable funds market, which gets transformed into investment spending, capital, and growth. So a lot of times we're going to talk about tax cuts, but it's actually tax cuts to try to get more capital equipment and economic growth. Now, ultimately, yes, some of these high income individuals are going to get a tax cut and they're going to blow it on stuff that doesn't actually grow the economy. So really well-designed tax policy can accomplish the goal that you want here. But if you just instead said, everybody earning over $500,000, we're just going to give them a giant tax cut, it may not produce the effects that you want, right? The more targeted that you can get with a tax cut that could lead people to actually spend more money on tools, machines, new construction, like apartment buildings and factories and stores, that's actually what's going to really grow the economy in the long run. This is not hard stuff to understand, I don't think, but it is stuff that actually will lead to economic growth and improving people's lives. I hope that this helped you understanding a little bit about what are the different aspects of supply side economics and how we could actually create economic growth. I'll see you next time.